As we've talked a lot about President Kennedy, now we're here where so much of our history was made in the 1960s. When we were having lunch over in the park just a moment ago, over on the far side was a building with HYC on it, and that stands for Hyannis Yacht Club. And President Kennedy learned to sail right in those waters, right over there, just a few hundred yards from where we're staying. He served in the United States military in World War II, and he served on a PT boat. The number was PT 109, and his boat would be sunk by the Japanese. And through heroic actions by Mr. Kennedy, he was able to save the lives of other sailors on board. He would go on to write a book, PT 109, Profiles in Courage and stuff, and from that he began to have notoriety. His father was very famous. His father was an ambassador and represented our country overseas, and his father was also very, very, very wealthy. So it allowed them the opportunity to live here in Hyannis and to have one of the most beautiful waterfront properties and all those things that money could buy. Mr. Kennedy would run for Congress and would be elected. In 1960, he decides to run for President of the United States. Many interesting things will happen in this political campaign. First and foremost, this was the first campaign that actually was really televised. Because you might find this hard to believe, but television was in its infancy, and basically everybody in America who had a TV, and that wasn't everybody, by the way, TVs were black and white. And he was running against a man named Richard Nixon. Now, Richard Nixon was just finishing being Vice President of the United States for 8 years. He had served under President Dwight Eisenhower. Now, President Eisenhower became very famous in world history. He was the commander of the Allied forces in World War II in Europe. And we defeated Nazi Germany, and President Eisenhower was a very popular figure. He selected Richard Nixon to run as his running mate in 1952. So Mr. Nixon, as you said, decides to run for president when President Eisenhower's second term is completed. In the beginning, Mr. Nixon had a pretty large lead in the polls. Mr. Kennedy was a Roman Catholic, and not everybody could really accept that. And there were all kinds of grumblings that somehow our nation had never had a Catholic president, that if we elected a Catholic president, all of a sudden, actually the Pope would be running our country. Now, nothing was farther from the truth, but you all see the rumors that take place on TV today, and things that are misstated, misspoken, and simply not true. So that created an uphill battle for President Kennedy. He was a very eloquent speaker. When we go to the museum a little later this afternoon, you'll have an opportunity to hear some of his presentations. He had that Massachusetts accent. He was a very handsome man, and he really commanded people's attention. Now, Mr. Nixon did not have the same ability to speak in public as Mr. Kennedy. And they would agree to a series of televised debates. It had never been done before. You've grown up, there always are debates. But in 1960, there had never been a televised debate. And the camera loved Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Nixon was very uncomfortable in front of the camera, almost to the point, a little bit of perspiration on the top lip. And it really helped springboard President Kennedy to have a chance to win the election. So in November of 1960, it becomes voting day. Mr. Kennedy comes here with his family, and they're awaiting the results. Right up the street, up here just when we came down, and you'll see it a little later, was the Armory. He was going to come to the Armory that night to either make an acceptance speech or to concede. But as the night wore on, we didn't have the pollsters that we have today. We didn't have all the electronic results coming in. And by midnight, it was clear we weren't going to know. because of the state of Illinois. It was the toss-up, and whoever was going to win Illinois was going to have enough electoral votes to be elected president. Mr. Kennedy would actually go to bed, okay, because nobody knew. And as Karen, our guide, was telling us earlier, lots of people had gathered here in hopes of hearing his, his speech. Everybody went home. We really did not know until the next morning that he had been elected president. As president, he went to the steps of the United States Capitol to be sworn in. He was sworn in on the east side of the Capitol, which was still the norm for those days. If you went to a presidential inauguration now, because there are so many more people that come, they do it on the west side of the Capitol, which faces down the mall towards the Washington Monument. But President Kennedy was one of the last presidents to be sworn in on the front or east side of the Capitol. He uttered the words that was kind of a call to action. He said to the American people, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." We think about lots of things that are happening today. We kind of really could use going back to that mantra of personal responsibility. He was very popular, but two things would happen fairly soon into his presidency. The first would be the Bay of Pigs crisis. We have a thwarted invasion of the communist country of Cuba, and it falls apart terribly, and his approval ratings really sink. And that will be followed by the construction of the Berlin Wall. Now, the Berlin Wall was built around part of the city of Berlin in Germany. The wall was, in places, 15, 16 feet high, other places even higher. And the wall separated the citizens of West Berlin. West Berlin was created at the end of World War II. America, England, and the Russians, Communist Russia, the Soviet Union, divided up the city of Berlin as kind of the spoils of war. The East Germans were under the control of the Russians. We had been through many years of the Cold War, worried about Russia, nuclear bombs, nuclear attack. And when this wall went up, it terrified the world. And there was great consternation. I was 15 years old, and I can remember they sent our high school baseball team to play baseball in West Berlin. Kind of as a message, I think, looking back at it, that we were going to be there no matter what the Russians were attempting to do. But standing on the baseball field and looking behind me at a large wall, and it was kind of fascinating because the East German soldiers, and I'm sure there are a few Russian soldiers mixed in, were sitting on the wall watching the baseball game. They really didn't know what baseball was all about. We have the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the tide changes for President Kennedy. The Russians are sending missiles to Cuba, only 90 miles off the Florida coast. Each one of those missiles capable of carrying a nuclear warhead that could wipe out an entire American city. It was an incredible threat to our nation's safety. The president of Russia at that time was a man named Nikita Khrushchev. And the president told Khrushchev to get the missiles out. And to the older adults here, I'm sure you remember those couple of nights, waiting to find out if, number one, the missiles that were there were going to be removed, and also there was a group of Russian ships headed towards Cuba with more. The president had incredible courage because he knew he risked the start of a world war. But Nikita Khrushchev will blink, and he will turn his ships around and head back to Russia. So in the early parts of President Kennedy's administration, things did not go well. But this becomes a great success for him. He decides, and he's laying the groundwork to be reelected, to serve a second term. Now remember, I told you the election took place in November of 1960, but he actually is not sworn into office under our Constitution until January 20th, 1961. His vice president was a man named Lyndon Johnson. And Mr. Johnson had been an incredible, powerful man in the House of Representatives and Congress, and was from the state of Texas. President Kennedy was invited to speak at several conferences in Dallas, Texas. And he would board Air Force One with Mrs. Kennedy, and they would fly to Dallas, and they would land at an airport called Love Field. Well, today Love Field is still there, but they built a much larger airport in Dallas-Fort Worth area now. But they would land at Love Field with Air Force One. There will be a motorcade through the streets of Dallas. There are literally tens and tens of thousands of people who turn out to see the president for miles down the main street of Dallas, 50 deep on each side. It was just an incredible response from the people of Texas to come and see the president, and it was a beautiful sunny day. As the motorcade is reaching the end of where all the people are lined up, it comes to the end of Main Street. It makes a right-hand turn. It goes just a few hundred yards and makes a left-hand turn to a road that's going to kind of go down and curve. On the corner is a building called the Texas School Book Depository. As the president's car is going down, and it was a convertible. Now, the Secret Service driving it, another Secret Service man in the front seat, and it actually had 3 sets of seats. In the second seat back was Mrs. Conley, who was the wife of the governor of Texas, John Conley. So you have the drivers here, the second Secret Service, Mrs. Conley, Governor Conley, Mrs. Kennedy in the back row, and President Kennedy here. He's on the side closest to behind him, the Texas School Book Depository. Shots will ring out. The president, and it was one person who filmed it. His last name was Zapruder. Shots will ring out, and in the Zapruder film, you see him reach and grab his neck. And the second shot obviously hits him in the back of the head. Everything goes flying. It's disastrous for the country. The motorcade speeds up and rushes to Parkland Hospital. There, about 45 minutes later, the word is broadcast to the nation that the President of the United States has been assassinated, that he is dead. It was heartbreaking. Our country came to a standstill for 3 days. I was in Texas. My father was stationed at Fort Hood. I was a junior in high school. They closed our high school immediately. I mean, within minutes. We jumped in the car and we drove to Dallas. And so within a couple of hours of it happening, we were actually, my friends and I were out on Dealey Plaza. We couldn't believe it. We could not believe that that could happen in our country. On Sunday morning, and this happens on Friday, November 22nd, 1963, President Kennedy had been president just about 1,000 days. On Sunday morning, everybody's gathered at home watching TV. There were only 3 networks, ABC, NBC, and CBS. You couldn't watch MTV or anything else, because there were only 3 networks in those days. And they announced that they had captured a gentleman named Lee Harvey Oswald later that afternoon on that Friday. And they think he's the shooter. And they announced on TV that on that Sunday morning, they're going to move him from the Dallas police station out to a prison. Incredibly, remember I told you the motorcade came to the end of Main Street, turned right, went a little distance, and turned left. On this corner was the Dallas County Police Station, and you could look from one to the other to the Texas School Book Depository. So the person, whoever shot him, did it right in front of basically in front of the police station. But they tell everybody on the news that they're going to move him. And everybody is at home watching TV. Virtually every store in America was closed. The only thing that operated on that Sunday was the National Football League. And the commissioner of the National Football League at the time, Pete Rozelle, would say later in his life it was the worst mistake he ever made, allowing the games to go on. That everything else was closed. We were all home watching TV. And they're covering and waiting for the policeman to bring out Lee Harvey Oswald, to put him in the car, to take him to prison. They have everything cleared from in front of the cameras, so that you could see them coming down the hall. I want you to picture this. And all of a sudden, the Texas Marshals, Rangers, I don't remember which they were exactly, but the police personnel come, and they're kind of arm in arm with him, leading him out. And out of nowhere, a man wearing a suit coat and a hat, okay, a dress hat, not a baseball cap, you see a hand come in front of the camera with a gun, and he shoots Lee Harvey Oswald dead on live television. This wasn't a make-believe show. This was for real. America on Friday lost its president, and on Sunday had a murder live on television. Never were ever quite the same. President Kennedy will be brought back to Washington, D.C. His body will lie in state under the Capitol Rotunda. When you go on AHT next year, you'll walk right through that same rotunda where President Kennedy's body lay in state. He will be buried at Arlington National Cemetery, across the river from Washington and Virginia. And his gravesite will have an eternal flame. It was lit by his wife to burn forever in his memory. The eternal flame has an interesting tie to our history. In 1934, in Gettysburg, President Roosevelt dedicated an eternal flame on the northern end of the battlefield at Gettysburg to represent our loss of all Americans, whether north or south. Only 2 or 3 months prior to President Kennedy's assassination, Mrs. Kennedy and her children visited Gettysburg. And she saw that flame, and she was very touched by it. And from that grew the choice to put the eternal flame at President Kennedy's gravesite. Only president for about 1,000 days, but he had a profound effect on America. From presidential debates, to foreign policy failures, to successes. But he also left us with a goal and a challenge. Because President Kennedy would address Congress, and he would pledge that America would put a man on the moon before the 1960s were over. Now, in 1957, the Russians launched the very first satellite, and America was in a panic. They wrote all kinds of educational programs. The older folks will remember the National Defense Education Act, and we were in a panic that the Russians were ahead of us in the space race. So we set out to also get our own satellite in orbit. The Russian satellite weighed hundreds of pounds. The Navy, our U.S. Navy, had been trying to get a satellite up, but every time they launched it, it blew up on the launch pad, failure after failure. At the end of World War II, we had captured a number of German rocket scientists. The Germans were ahead of everybody with rocketry. And a man named Werner von Braun, he came forward, and he literally put together a makeshift rocket and satellite. It was called Explorer 1, okay? And by golly, we finally got a satellite in orbit. Remember, I told you the Russians weighed in the hundreds of pounds. Our satellite weighed 3.5 pounds. And it had 2 things on it, a beacon so you could track it, and they were trying to do one other thing. But at least we had the success that we had put the satellite in orbit. Now, to get from a 3.5 pound satellite to a launch vehicle that could take men to the moon was a Herculean task. In order to get into orbit around the Earth, and see people your age, my age at the time, they were enthralled with the space program. In order to get a satellite into orbit, you had to reach a speed of 17,500 miles an hour. You had to have a pretty darn powerful rocket. And von Braun devised this system where we would have a launch vehicle, 3 stages, The first two would you use to get into orbit. Because in order to get out of the orbit of the Earth to go to the moon, you then had to speed up to 25,000 miles an hour to break the gravitational pull of the Earth. And so von Braun is telling President Kennedy all of this. See? And this is what we actually ended up using. All of von Braun's plans to take America to the moon. In July of 1969, Apollo 11 goes to the moon, and Neil Armstrong becomes the first human being to come down the steps. So although President Kennedy didn't live to see that, he in fact was the person who drove our country to do this. He was an amazing person, an amazing part of history, but a man of courage, and he was loved by his community here. This memorial was built by the people of Barnstable to recognize their president. If you look at the front of that, and if you were to take out a 50-cent piece, you'll see the match. And he said, just an incredible guy. Believe in your dreams. The thing that President Kennedy loved most, though, was to be out on that water in his sailboat with his family. This was always home. And the news media began to call this Camelot and the Summer White House, because this is where he loved to be. And you're retracing his footsteps. So remember what he said. Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Think to today, all the men and women who serve our nation, they've made that commitment. Thank you for listening. Back to the bus.